So with apportionment, where did the U.S. start and where have we ended up?
We started in a decent place and we're ending in a dumpster fire.
Well, that doesn't sound good.
No, it certainly does not. But before we dig into that, let's introduce ourselves.
Righto.
I am Sam Hansen.
And I'm Sadie Witkowski.
And you are listening to Carry the Two, a podcast from the Institute for Mathematical and Statistical Innovation, aka IMSI.
The podcast where Sam and I talk about the real-world applications of mathematical and statistical research.
This is the second episode of our season all about the mathematics of democracy and politics. Last episode, we talked all about voting, and this time we'll be digging into apportionment, or how states are assigned representatives.
And going by that voice we heard at the top, we have another similarity to last episode, don't we?
Good ears, Sadie. You are right. We are again joined by Ismar Volić, professor and chair of the mathematics department at Wellesley College, director of the Institute for Mathematics and Democracy, and author of Making Democracy Count: How Mathematics Improves Voting, Electoral Maps, and Representation.
He was a great guide to voting last time, so I'm happy to hear from him about apportionment. Although it does seem from the dumpster fire comment, it might be fair to say he feels pretty similarly about both how the U.S. does apportionment and how we handle voting.
That wouldn't be unfair to say, but let's start with where apportionment was at the founding.
Okay, let's get into it then.
The apportionment was actually a big topic at the Constitutional Convention, right? The founders, the framers, really talked about this a lot. They were trying to figure out a system by which a representative would represent a reasonable number of people. They would be someone who, their constituents would be small enough in size so that the representative can have the sense of what they want, right? The representative can have the finger on the pulse of their constituents. So Madison in particular came up with some numbers. They said, we should have about 30,000 people per representative. He realized this may have to grow as the population grows. He said something like 50,000 would be, as high as we should go.
Since we don't have thousands of members of the House of Representatives, I'm guessing we've gone a bit beyond where Madison thought we should land.
Just by a little bit.
So right now, there are 760,000 people per representative in the United States.
Yeah, just off Madison's recommendation by about an order of magnitude or so. Jeez.
To be fair to Madison, the population of the country has now grown by more than one order of magnitude. But getting back to the current times, Ismar says asking one person to represent that many people is just not tenable.
It's kind of laughable. I mean, there's no way that a person can represent 760,000 people faithfully, right? Understand all of the concerns and desires and needs and political aspirations of 760,000 people. So there's a greater gap than ever between those who represent them. I'm talking about the federal, the House of Representatives with its 435 seats. There has never been such a huge gap between those who represent us and us who they're supposed to be representing. And of course, any gap is very quickly filled by, special interests and lobbyists, et cetera.
Okay, I'm starting to understand the dumpster fire comment.
Exactly. But remember, apportionment in the states didn't start out this badly.
As the population grew from the Constitutional Convention, so did the size of the House of Representatives. An attempt was made to keep this ratio reasonable.
So what happened? Why is the ratio so large now?
It was staying kind of reasonable until the 1920s, where because of the politics of the time that had to do with an influx of immigrants and rural versus urban divide and Republicans and Democrats, whatever. It was the politics of the moment, and because of it, that the House size got frozen in time then. A legislation was passed, the Reapportionment Act, that froze the size of the House of Representatives where it was at that moment, and that happened to be 435.
This was the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929. And at that time, this would have meant that a member of the House would be representing around 280,000 people.
That already seems like a lot of people.
Right? And the U.S. population has grown 3 times as large since then.
Yeah, that seems not ideal. How does the U.S. compare to other countries who do this kind of thing?
Badly? Most other democratic countries change the number of representatives as their populations grow, leaving our ratio quite far afield.
There are these graphs of OECD countries, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. That's our sort of cohort that we're compared to in these statistics, and we are really an outlier when you look at where the representations are. We're like off the chart somewhere.
So what does Ismar think would be more reasonable?
If we follow sort of the math that most countries follow, we should be at around 700. That should be the size of the House.
The around 700, 693 to be exact, number comes from the cube root law, devised in 1972 by political scientist Rein Tagapera, who observed that in many democracies, the number of representatives was close to the cube root of the population.
And that would be, what, around 500,000 people per member of the House?
That sounds right.
500,000 still seems like a lot.
For sure, but it's still a third less than they're covering now. Ismar knows that this would be a big ask, of course.
I realize it's not a popular opinion. Like if I go out on the street and say, we should increase. See how dysfunctional Congress is? We should have more of those people. That would not go over well. But ultimately, it would be better, actually.
Oh, yeah. I can see how telling people that one of the best ways to fix our government, being more politicians, is not going to go over too well.
Yeah, I'd see that too. Though Ismar did tell me that a larger House is more likely to encourage broader coalition and cross-party cooperation.
I mean, yeah, sure. You might have me convinced, but it still seems like a hard sell.
For sure, and there have been increasing attempts to make this change, and none of them have really caught on as of yet.
Yeah, that's too bad. I do have another question about all of this, though, as it seems to me that we're skipping past an important bit of mathematics when it comes to apportionment.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, sure, it's important to figure out the number of representatives, but how do we decide how many get assigned to each state?
You're right. That is an important bit of mathematics, one with a very specific issue.
As much as we'd like to, maybe sometimes we can't really chop up representatives into decimal fractional pieces. So how do you round? Basically, it's a rounding problem.
And at the founding, there were 2 competing methods for solving this rounding problem. One proposed by Thomas Jefferson and the other by Alexander Hamilton. And personally, I'm never going to forgive Lin-Manuel Miranda for not making one of the cabinet battles about the greatest remainders versus greatest divisors fight.
It certainly would have been memorable, though it's probably already enough of a fight to stage a rap musical about the founding fathers without bringing math into it.
But just think. Daveed Diggs could have been dropping bars like, but Hamilton miscalculates. His plan opens up multi-paradox gates from new states to Alabama to population, yet he moves forward with no hesitation.
Sam, stop. Please, just stop.
Okay, my Hamilton maths version fan fiction can wait, I guess.
Put it on AO3 or put it forever on ice. Either way. How about instead you tell me more about Hamilton and Jefferson's methods?
Sure, I was going to rap about them, but both rely on calculating what is known as the standard divisor, which is the total population divided by the number of seats to be apportioned. Then you take a state's population and divide it by the standard divisor, which will give you a fractional number of seats a state would get.
So this is where Ismar's comment about chopping up representatives comes from.
Exactly. Hamilton's method then rounds down to the nearest whole number to set the floor for the number of representatives a state gets. This, of course, assigns fewer seats than needed. So the method then assigns an extra seat to states depending on how large of a remainder there is left after rounding.
So if the standard divisor is 4 and there are states A and B with populations of 10 and 15, B would get the extra seat since it has a remainder of 3 instead of A's remainder of 2.
Exactly. Jefferson's method is a bit more confusing. Instead of rounding down and then assigning extra seats, it keeps on changing the standard divisor until you get the correct number of seats when you round down each state.
Okay.
What's important to know is that both methods have their own issues. Jefferson's method violates what's known as the quota rule, which is that a state should receive a number of seats equal to either rounding up or down from the value you get when dividing by the standard divisor.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable.
And in Jefferson's method, it is possible for a state to go above that number of seats. And while Hamilton's method meets the quota rule, it can trigger the Alabama paradox, where a state loses a seat when the total number of seats is increased, the new states paradox, where adding a new state along with a proportional number of new seats still changes the overall apportionment, and the population paradox, where state A grows more than state B, but still loses a seat to state B.
Right.
But to be fair, we only know about these issues in hindsight.
So then which one did the founders end up choosing? Who won the rap battle?
Well, Hamilton convinced Congress on his method, but
Washington vetoed Hamilton's method. That was the first ever presidential veto in the history of the United States, one of only 2 that Washington issued. And he adopted Jefferson's method. Why? Because according to the Jefferson method, Virginia would have received 1 more seat, and Washington and Jefferson were from Virginia, over the Hamilton method. Hamilton method would have given it 1 less. So, right there, like the outset of our republic, you see this like political bickering and scheming, like who's going to get 1 more seat where. And that really has unfortunately followed the history of this problem over the last 250 years or so.
But that was then. I assume we don't still use the Jefferson method.
We do not. It has in fact changed a number of times over the years, including using Hamilton's method at times. Then, after the 1929 Reapportionment Act, Congress decided that it needed to officially set a method that would work well with the now capped 435 seats. There were 2 main contenders, the Webster and the Huntington-Hill methods.
And are these methods more similar to the Hamilton or Jefferson methods?
They are closer to the Jefferson method, as both rely on changing the standard divisor to get to the right number of seats. Where they differ is that they allow for rounding up as well as rounding down. Webster's method relies on the typical 0.5 rounding cutoff, while Huntington-Hill uses the geometric mean.
So then, which did they end up going with?
Well, it came down to a fight between Edward Huntington, a well-known mathematician, and Walter Wilcox, the founder of the U.S. Census Bureau's Statistical Research Office. On the positive side of things, this is one of the few cases where Congress consulted with members of the mathematical sciences research community.
This implies there is a negative side, Sam.
And that negative side is that it all still came down to politics.
A panel of mathematicians was assembled by the American Academy of Sciences, and Huntington he wasn't on it, but he was such a large presence in the mathematical community at the time that this panel was sort of, loath to go against what he had preferred. So that might have influenced the final endorsement of the Huntington-Hill method by this panel of mathematicians. And then there was another panel some 20 years later that reaffirmed this decision. But that panel had one of the same mathematicians on it, so they weren't going to decide differently this time around.
Great.
I know it sounds bad, but according to Ismar, it really isn't that big of a deal, even if he does slightly prefer the Webster method himself.
Webster and Huntington-Hill are solid methods. Like and most of the time they give the same outcome, so it's not such a big deal that we're using one versus the other.
That's good to hear, that at least both methods generally agree on the result. But I guess I can't help but wonder if there's something even better we could be using.
Well...
Oh no, you're going to do it to me again, aren't you?
Do what to you again?
Tell me that the math has shown yet another thing is impossible, like voting.
Maybe. Can we at least do apportionment, like mathematically perfectly?
No. We can't do anything perfectly in democracy, no matter how hard we try. There is yet another impossibility theorem in the apportionment arena called Belinsky-Young, which basically says there's no perfect apportionment method either. Every apportionment method will fail. Will fail. But again, the evidence that we have for Huntington Hill and Webster is that, or not, the evidence is that they don't fail it in practice very often. I don't think they ever have in the last 70 years. And also we know probabilistically that theoretically they would fail some of these criteria very, very rarely.
We also need to state that when we're talking about apportionment at the founding and the fight between the different methods of Hamilton and Jefferson, they were assigning seats to states based on populations that were being calculated under the 3/5 compromise, where each enslaved person was counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of population and taxation without being afforded any of the rights of citizens.
Not to mention the lack of voting rights for all but the most privileged of white men. And even though property owner restrictions went away over the first few decades, white women weren't granted the universal right to vote until 1920. Indigenous Americans had to wait until 1947, and Black Americans until 1965.
And no amount of mathematics can make voting or apportionment work when the government doesn't allow large swaths of its population the right of suffrage. Have you ever wondered what goes on inside a black hole, why time moves in one direction, or what's really so weird about quantum mechanics? Well, if so, you should listen to Why This Universe. On Why This Universe, you'll hear about the strangest and most interesting ideas in physics, broken down by physicists Dan Hooper and Shama Wagsman. If you want to learn about our universe from the quantum to the cosmic, you won't want to miss Why This Universe, part of the University of Chicago Podcast Network. There's one last thing that I want to share with you, Sadie. You could say it lies right at the middle of apportionment and voting.
Are we finally getting to the Electoral College?
We are finally getting to the Electoral College. So during the Constitutional Convention, when the election of the president came up, it was quite clear that the South would not allow direct election of the president. As James Madison wrote, "There was one difficulty, however, of a serious nature attending an immediate choice by the people. The right of suffrage was much more diffuse in the northern than the southern states, and the latter could have no influence in the election on the score of enslaved peoples. It was also clear that the convention thought it had more important things to think about."
It was one of these things nobody wanted to talk about, nobody could agree on. It was relegated to this committee on unfinished business. What a nightmare, right? Can you imagine sitting on a committee of unfinished business?
Monty Python style, the Committee of Unfinished Business. Yeah, that does not seem like a top priority.
And after something like 30 votes, the Electoral College was finally approved as a compromise that allowed the slave-holding states to leverage the 3/5 compromise in order to have more of a say in the presidential election. And specifics of the Electoral College aside, Ismar thinks that the history of how it was developed holds an important lesson.
We cling to these decisions that the framers made as the end-all be-all of the highest intellectual and moral thinking, and but no, they're humans who just want to get back home after how many weeks of sitting at this convention, and they just came up with this compromise. Nobody, well, by definition of compromise, nobody was really happy with it.
I am always in favor of remembering that people from history, especially the so-called great people from history, are just that, people.
Exactly. And like all people, it's possible they made a mistake.
Very quickly became clear that it didn't make any sense, and it certainly does not make sense today. I mean, you don't even need mathematical evidence to support these claims. the only thing you need to realize is kind of, extract yourself from American exceptionalism for 2 seconds and look around and realize that no country in the world uses anything like the Electoral College. And all the new countries that were formed in the last, it's not like all the countries were there already, right? So it was too late. Lots of new countries came to be in the last 150 years. None of them have anything close to the Electoral College.
I've personally been arguing against the Electoral College for years, but we are a math and stats podcast, so maybe we should take a look at the mathematical evidence.
That's a fair point. The first and most obvious one is that under the Electoral College, the winner of the popular vote may not be elected president.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, it's happened 5 times in the history of the U.S., and it even happened during my lifetime as a voter. I'm sure it's happened 2 times in the last 25 years.
And while that might be the most obvious mathematical evidence against the Electoral College, it's by far from the only mathematical evidence.
The disproportionate power that voters have if they live in certain states. So if you look at, the last elections, 2020, it would have been enough for a handful of voters, handful in relation to the, millions and millions who voted, something like, we're talking about a total of 40,000 voters or something. If they had lived in a different state with the same political preference, and if they had just lived in a different state, the outcome would have been different.
I think about that one a lot. We both live in Illinois, and when it comes to the presidential election, our votes don't really matter.
I know, and I moved rather recently. I used to live in Michigan and Wisconsin, 2 states where my vote had disproportionate power.
Which never ceases to make me angry. Why should where I live change the worth of my vote for a national office like the president?
It shouldn't, and it can lead to massive disenfranchisement, as Ismar notes.
Or I think about the 30% of Republican voters in Massachusetts who also, they might as well stay home on election day, right? They get not only the presidential elections, they have no representation in Congress whatsoever because our entire delegation is Democrats, right? Millions of Republican voters in California, which makes no difference. Their votes make no difference for presidential elections. It's like there's a lot of disenfranchisement going on because of the Electoral College, because it ties, it anchors our elections to states, and that's not the right thing.
But my understanding is that we're sort of stuck with it, aren't we? After all, it is in the Constitution.
Yeah, you're right about that. The clearest way to move away from the Electoral College would be with a constitutional amendment. Though there are people who are trying to push for the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, where enough states get together so that they have 270 electors between them, and they agree to assign their electors to the winner of the National Popular Vote.
Oh, yeah, I have heard of that. Where does it stand?
They're close, but still short of the 270 electors needed. Plus, it's not clear that the compact would stand up to legal review even if it did reach the threshold. Though not everyone thinks that getting rid of the Electoral College entirely is the right thing to do.
I do think there's a little bit of flux where the college doesn't follow the popular vote. In close elections, like 300,000 across the country, I think that's a feature of the system, and encourages, both campaigns to fight a little bit harder next time out for both parties.
Wow, that is not an opinion I have heard much. Who is it saying this?
I'll let him introduce himself.
So I'm Theodore R. Johnson, or Ted, and I am a columnist at the Washington Post and a senior advisor at a think tank in D.C. called New America.
And Ted comes at this question from a rather different perspective than our last guest.
Look, I'm a retired military guy who reinvented himself in his 40s to be a scholar on race and democracy.
In particular, one of the big reasons Ted was drawn to these areas of scholarship was because of
just how lopsided the Black vote has been, really since the 15th Amendment in 1870, but in particular since 1960s and the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act of 65. And I've always wondered whether voting so uniformly helps Black Americans achieve their policy desires and goals, or whether it creates a vacuum of competition wherein one party assumes it has it, takes the vote for granted, the other party doesn't even attempt it. Does that create a quandary wherein the political demands of a group are ignored because it's sort of captured by one side?
Which leads directly to questions about the Electoral College, since, as Ted told me,
because I think competition for every voter matters in a democracy that pretends to be responsive to its public.
And as we know, there is little competition for voters in most states due to the Electoral College. But then why does Ted not want to abolish it entirely as well?
For those same competition reasons. Just instead of only competing in swing states, he's also worried about competition becoming all about the most populous states.
I'm less a fan of the national popular vote because it allows for wide margins in populous states to basically become insurmountable pretty quickly. If you're winning by, 1.5 million votes in California, then it's hard to pick that up in Rhode Island and Wyoming and Alabama. It becomes a bit too much.
So then what does he think we should do about the Electoral College?
He shared two potential paths towards reforming the Electoral College. In the first one
is to do what Maine and Nebraska do, which is basically partition out electors by congressional district.
And what about the two electoral votes that aren't tied to congressional districts?
Those would go to the state popular vote winner.
Okay. I can definitely see how this is better than what we have now, but I feel like this is still hiding some downsides.
It is, and one of them is pretty big. So big, in fact, that Carry the Two has covered it before.
So a congressional model relies on how the districts are drawn, and a state with a lot of partisan gerrymandering is going to bake in inherent advantages for one party over the other, even when you go to that partitioning of electors within a state.
Of course. The G word. I was wondering we were going to mention gerrymandering.
Well, we don't have the time to dig into it right now, so if you want to learn more, go check out the Moon Dushin episode of Carry the Two from a deep dive. It's a great one. Sadie was the producer back then. Instead, let's talk about the other approach for reforming the Electoral College.
So what I like is the proportional allocation approach. And what this does is allows a state to partition its electors based on the statewide popular vote. So you win 60% of the popular vote, you get 60% of that state's electors rounded up to the next whole number.
And you keep going down past the second top vote getter, too.
Ross Perot would have gotten 7, 8, 9 electoral votes in California and in Texas based on how many popular votes he received.
Ted sees this method of proportional allocation as providing a good balance between the popular vote and the positive parts of the Electoral College.
The results of a state in the Electoral College more closely mirror the popular vote. And that is a good thing. And it does so without eradicating some of the protections the Electoral College built in for low population states, for example, to ensure that the tyranny of the majority doesn't, 50% plus one doesn't get to ram its agenda down the other side's throat.
He says it more closely mirrors the popular vote. Does that mean we wouldn't get the popular and electoral vote split anymore?
Not exactly.
In this proportional allocation method, Bush still wins. But the difference is, there's a number of them. One of them is the vote doesn't come down to Florida. The election doesn't come down to Florida.
But why does the election not coming down to Florida matter?
It all comes back to the idea of competition. Not only does it not come down to Florida, the election wouldn't have come down to any single state, which Ted thinks would make a huge difference.
Republicans now campaign more in California so they don't lose by 15%, they only lose by 7%, and they win electors for the effort. Same for Democrats in Texas.
And our votes in Illinois would mean something.
Exactly, and they still wouldn't overpower our Iowan neighbors' votes, even though we have 4 times the population, which is core to Ted's vision.
The protection of political minorities across the country is a feature of liberal democracies. It's actually part of what the college was created to do. It employed mathematics from an electoral calendar or electoral map from the 18th century. And so it's just time for us to update the math. But the idea that political minorities should be protected in a democracy is a constitutional one. It's an American one and one most people support.
That is not to say that Ted doesn't see limits to this need.
I am all for allowing for political minorities to have an opportunity to win office, but not when they're in the minority by 8 million votes nationwide in an election where about 140 something million people voted.
Seems like a reasonable caveat.
It certainly does. But do you know what I like the most about these reforms versus the popular vote?
No, I'm not sure I do.
They are much easier to implement.
So if every state independently decided to partition its electors like Maine or Nebraska, or to do a proportional allocation like we've discussed, they absolutely could. And the Constitution allows that. Both the Elections Clause and I even think maybe the 10th Amendment would permit it.
Oh, hands down, that would be my favorite part too.
Right? Now, before we sign off, I want to share one last thing that Ismar told me about why it's important for us to use mathematics and statistics to look at our democratic systems.
Why? Why are we talking about math and democracy? Well, there's this simple realization that once you make it, it opens lots of doors very widely. And of course, everything is simple retroactively once you figure it out, right? But this is really simple. When you think about many of our basic democratic processes, they are really mathematical in nature, right? There's some algorithms, some formulas, some equations that are determining how you go about the mechanics of our democracy. And we've talked about voting. That's, how do you tally the votes? How do you decide the size of the House of Representatives? How do you actually apportion these seats? How do you divide 435 into 50 states, right? So that's some kind of a mathematical process. Once you make the realization and you start digging into what math governs these processes, you quickly also realize that a lot of them are completely broken. They're dysfunctional. They are causing, they are just outright discriminatory often. They do not represent us. They are not capturing our will and all these things. At the same time, math can suggest better processes like using runoff instead of plurality, right? Increase the size of the House of Representatives to a certain number that can be mathematically determined, optimized mathematically. And what is the formula by which you allocate seats of the House of Representatives, right? Are we using the right one? What is the right one? What does that even mean? Should we be using a different one? And so on. So many of our processes function mathematically like this, and this is what I'm trying to kind of impart, right? We should be studying democracy from this impartial, apolitical, mathematical point of view, and we should be asking, do we have the best math governing our processes? And if we implement better one, it'll increase representation, it'll increase diversity, it'll really help our democracy.
Don't forget to check out our show notes in the podcast description for more Ismar and Ted, including links to their work we discussed on the episode.
And if you like the show, give us a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify or wherever you listen. By rating and reviewing the show, you really help us spread the word about Carry the Two so other listeners can discover us.
And for more on the math research being shared at MC, be sure to check us out online at our homepage, mc.institute. We're also on Twitter at mc_institute, as well as Instagram at mc.institute. That's MC spelled IMSI.
And do you have a burning math question? Maybe you have an idea for a story on how mathematics and statistics connect with the world around us. Send us an email with your idea.
You can send your feedback, ideas, and more to sam@mc.institute. That's sam@imsi.institute.
We'd also like to thank Blue Dot Sessions for the music we use in Carry the Two.
Lastly, Carry the Two is made possible by the Institute for Mathematical and Statistical Innovation, located on the gorgeous campus of the University of Chicago. We are supported by the National Science Foundation and the University of Chicago.